In July of 1932, our nation was in the midst of an economic crisis that may well have been the greatest threat to the nation's democracy since the Civil War. Unemployment was at 25%, and only one quarter of those that were desperately seeking work were receiving any kind of public relief. Neither the president nor the Congress could seem to come up with a unified path forward. The crisis was global. Many people around the world had lost faith in their governments and were turning to totalitarianism and autocratic dictators for leadership. Many in the United States believed that the government had failed them. Familiar social norms had become upset. Political institutions that once provided stability seemed totally ineffectual. Fear and hopelessness filled the minds and hearts of our citizens. Labor disputes, protests, and social disruptions were common across the country, some turning violent. In 1932, commitment to the concept of public school faltered when many citizens facing unemployment or reduced incomes could no longer pay their property taxes. Retrenchment became the buzzword for budget cutbacks, resulting in reduction in the hours schools operated, increased class sizes, and decrease in teachers' salaries. Adding to school funding problems was a trend for youth to stay in school longer, since unemployment was tough to find during the Great Depression. As a result, more youth were seeking an education.
Black students, facing racism, poverty, and neglect, were severely impacted. Segregated schools were common during the 1930s. Although separate schools for Black and white children were required under the law to be separate but equal, the buildings, classrooms, supplies, and books, and the treatments of students and teachers were most often unequal. Schools for Black children received less money, were sometimes given discarded books from white schools, and had to make do with lower quality buildings and facilities. Few Black schools were offered standard high school programs, and teachers often suffered from lack of training facilities and lower salaries. Other minority groups also experienced segregation in schools. In the 1930s, Cherokee children often attended missionary schools that frequently required them to speak English rather than their native language. Teachers sometimes also tried to move students away from their traditional beliefs. Students with visual, hearing, or physical disabilities also faced segregation, with many having to attend boarding schools far away from home. Educational opportunities for students with mental disabilities were severely limited, which meant that these students often were not able to attend school at all.
The Dust Bowl presented specific problems for rural schools. The dust was such that the middle of the day would be completely dark and lanterns were sometimes lit so that students could continue with their lessons. Students were sent home from school because of the dust storms, but teachers worried that the students would lose their way on the walk home, and sometimes students were kept at school overnight. Many poor rural school districts closed their doors. Children whose families farmed for a living already might have had to miss school at planting time or harvest. Now, teenagers often had to quit school altogether, either to help with the family farm or leave home to find non-agricultural jobs. Children of tenant farmers, sharecroppers, and migrant workers had even greater trouble, as they often had to change schools when their parents moved to find work and housing. For all groups, there was a general decrease in monetary support for public school due to the falling of property taxes. At the same time, the crisis greatly transformed teachers' working conditions. Educators observed the deterioration of school programs they had spent years building. Teachers had to try to teach undernourished children whose families had been devastated by unemployment and could no longer afford to eat well. Teachers fought back against retrenchment. Membership in organized teachers' unions rose significantly. Educators radicalized and called for teachers to take charge of creating an entirely new social order, redistributing the wealth for a fairer America. Experimental schools, such as folk schools and labor colleges, trained students for the new order by teaching courses in labor organizing, political reform, civil rights, and reform in housing and healthcare. Conservative groups, such as the American Legion, perceived civil rights and organizing activities for unions as communistic. Alarmed by the new rhetoric, they feared communism was creeping into all levels of public schooling.
Despite the many challenges to public education, the crisis of the 1930s spurred lasting positive changes in our public education. The portion of school budgets from state funds increased. Teachers fought for and won higher standards for the teaching profession in the mid-1930s. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, also challenged school segregation in a number of court cases. Based on concepts from President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal reform, students who have never had success started receiving instruction in alternative settings and stayed in school. The most dismissal years for schools were between 1932 and 1936, but by 1939, America's deep-rooted desire to maintain and improve public education began to reemerge. Public education was seen as the path for the common good and the expression of the worth and potential of its citizens. In the end, a crisis that threatened the survival of public education and perhaps even the very democratic principles that served as the foundation of our country left our nation clamoring for more and better education for all of its students, resulting in a better, stronger public education. Now, in 2020, a global health, economic, political, and societal crisis is upon us. The 2020 to 2021 school year is already different than any other we've known. Our nation faces many of the same challenges that we did in 1932, and now, more than ever, the elected officials that govern our local school districts are being called upon to lead our communities forward.